There is a version of history that governments write, the version that appears in official records, in military dispatches, in the documents that commanders send upward through the chain of command to the men who need to believe that the war is going well and the enemy is manageable and the sacrifices being demanded of the nation are proportionate to the threat being faced. And then there is the version that soldiers write to each other, in letters that were never meant to be read by anyone above them, in diaries kept in the field that recorded what actually happened rather than what the official account required to have happened, in the private assessments that experienced officers share with trusted colleagues when the official version and the reality on the ground have stopped resembling each other. For a decade beginning in 1912, the Ottoman military fought Greek soldiers across 3 conflicts that reshaped the entire Eastern Mediterranean: the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the First World War from 1914 to 1918, the Greco-Turkish War from 1919 to 1922. 3 conflicts, a decade of fighting, thousands of engagements across mountains and plains and coastlines that both nations had been contesting for centuries. The official Ottoman and Turkish version of what their soldiers thought about fighting Greeks is not complicated. It fits the narrative that every military establishment prefers when describing an enemy it has fought for years. The Greeks were manageable. The Greek army was inferior. Greek resistance, when it occurred, was the result of geography or numbers or allied support, never of the inherent quality of the Greek soldier. The private version is different. It exists in correspondence that survived the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the chaos of the Turkish War of Independence. In after-action reports that were filed and then quietly buried in archives that nobody was supposed to look at too carefully. In the letters of Ottoman officers who described, with the directness that men who are not writing for the official record use, what it was actually like to fight Greeks in the mountains of Macedonia and the plains of Anatolia and the coastlines of the Aegean. What those letters say is not what the official history says. This is the story of what Turkish soldiers actually said after fighting Greeks, the version their officers tried to bury. To understand what the Ottoman military thought about Greek soldiers, you need to go back to 1912. And to go back to 1912, you need to understand what the Ottoman military thought about Greek soldiers before 1912. The Ottoman Empire of the early 20th century was a military establishment in crisis. The empire that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the cataracts of the Nile, had been contracting for a century. The Russian wars had cost territory in the north. The Balkan uprisings had cost territory in Europe. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s had cost Greece itself, which had been part of the empire for nearly 4 centuries. The Ottoman military establishment of 1912 had a specific view of the Greek army. It was not a view built on recent direct experience. The last major Ottoman-Greek conflict had been the War of 1897, a brief and largely successful Ottoman campaign that had reversed Greek territorial gains in Thessaly and ended in a Greek defeat that the Ottoman military establishment remembered as evidence of Greek military weakness. 1897 was the reference point, and 1897 said that the Greek army was not a serious military threat. This assessment was held by men who had reasons to hold it and experience that seemed to support it. The Ottoman army had fought the Greeks in 1897 and won. The Greek army in 1897 was poorly organized, poorly supplied, and commanded by officers whose professional preparation was inadequate for the scale of operations being conducted. The Ottoman victory was not overwhelming. It was limited by great power intervention that stopped the advance before it reached Athens. But it was a victory, and military establishments remember victories. What the Ottoman establishment had not fully accounted for in its assessment of Greek military capability was what had happened to the Greek army in the 15 years between 1897 and 1912. The humiliation of 1897 had produced something in Greece that humiliating defeats sometimes produce in nations that have the institutional capacity to learn from them. It had produced reform, serious, systematic, professional reform of the kind that changes what an army can do. French military advisors, new officers trained abroad, new equipment procured systematically, new doctrine developed and practiced, new leaders promoted on the basis of competence rather than connection. The Greek army that mobilized in October 1912 was not the Greek army that had been defeated in 1897. It was a different institution, smaller than the Ottoman force it was about to face, but more coherent, better led, and possessed of something that the Ottoman assessment had not factored into its calculations. It was possessed of men who were fighting for something specific, not for an empire, not for territory in the abstract, for cities and villages and coastlines and mountains that Greeks had been living in for thousands of years, and that the Ottoman Empire had been governing with varying degrees of tolerance and brutality since the 15th century. Men who looked at the map and saw not strategic objectives, but homes, whose fathers and grandfathers had told them stories about what those places were before the Ottomans came, and what they might be again if the fighting went the right way. The motivation gap between an imperial army fighting to maintain a contracting empire and a national army fighting to reclaim what it believed was its birthright is not something that appears in order of battle assessments or equipment inventories. It does not show up in the professional analyses that military establishments produce when they evaluate opposing forces, but it shows up in the fighting. On October 18th, 1912, the First Balkan War begins. The Greek army of Thessaly, commanded by Crown Prince Constantine, who has spent years preparing himself for exactly this moment, who has studied military science in Germany and observed operations in the field and returned to Greece, determined that the next Greek army would not fight the way the 1897 army fought, begins its advance north toward Macedonia. What happens in the next 6 weeks shatters the Ottoman military's assessment of Greek fighting capability so completely that the officers trying to write coherent after-action reports struggled to reconcile what they observed with everything they believed going into the campaign. The Greek army at the Battle of Sarantaporo on October 22, 1912, takes an Ottoman defensive position in mountain terrain that military doctrine describes as nearly impregnable. The Sarantaporo Pass is a natural fortress, steep slopes, narrow approaches, defending forces with the inherent advantage of elevation and prepared positions. The Ottoman force holding it is not a second-line formation. It is a regular army unit with artillery support and orders to hold. The Greek infantry attacks uphill, in mountain terrain, against prepared positions. It takes the pass. The after-action report, filed by the Ottoman commander of the defending force, is a document that its author clearly found painful to write. He describes Greek infantry behavior that does not match the 1897 reference point. He describes units that maintained cohesion under fire that should have broken them. He describes officers who led from the front in a way that Ottoman doctrine, which placed officers further back in the command structure, had not prepared his men to expect or respond to. He describes a speed and aggressiveness of assault that gave his defenders no time to regroup between attacks. He files the report. It goes upward through the chain of command. It joins other reports from other engagements along the front that are saying, with varying degrees of directness, the same thing. The Greeks are not what we expected. 5 days later, the Battle of Giannitsa. The Greek army, advancing rapidly north through Macedonia, encounters a strong Ottoman defensive position on the shores of Lake Giannitsa. The terrain again favors the defender. The Ottoman forces again have artillery. The Greek infantry again attacks. The battle lasts 2 days. At the end of it, the Greek army has broken through, and the road to Thessaloniki, Salonika, the second city of Macedonia, a city that both Greeks and Bulgarians are racing to reach first, is open. The Greek army reaches Thessaloniki on November 8, 1912. It enters the city hours before Bulgarian forces arrive. The Ottoman garrison, 26,000 men, surrenders to Crown Prince Constantine, not to the Bulgarians who have been fighting toward the city from the north, to the Greeks who got there first. In the Ottoman command structure, the reports from the Macedonian campaign are producing a picture that nobody at the senior level wanted to see. The Greek army has advanced further and faster than the Ottoman assessment said was possible. It has taken defensive positions that the assessment said should have held. It has maintained its operational tempo through weather and terrain and Ottoman resistance that the assessment said would slow it to a manageable pace. The private correspondence of Ottoman officers from this period, letters written to colleagues and family members preserved in archives that survived the empire's collapse, carries a tone that the official reports do not. The official reports maintain the professional language of military analysis. They describe tactical situations and unit dispositions and the reasons why specific positions were lost. They are written by men who know their superiors will read them and who understand that certain conclusions are unwelcome. The private letters are written by men who are trying to process what they have just experienced, and what they have just experienced does not fit the framework they brought into the campaign. One Ottoman officer, a veteran of the 1897 campaign who had been present for the Greek defeat in Thessaly, writes to a colleague in Constantinople in November 1912. He writes that he does not understand the Greek army he is fighting now. He writes that the men attacking his positions fight with a quality that he cannot reconcile with what he remembered from 1897. He writes, and this directness is only possible in a private letter, that if someone had shown him these men's performance in 1897, he would not have believed they were the same nation's soldiers. He is right. They are not the same army. 15 years of reform and motivation and preparation have made them into something the Ottoman assessment had no framework for. The First Balkan War ends in Ottoman defeat. Greece gains Thessaloniki, most of Macedonia, Epirus, and the Aegean Islands. The territorial gains double the size of the Greek state. The army that the Ottoman establishment dismissed as a manageable threat has, in the space of 6 weeks, changed the map of the Eastern Mediterranean more dramatically than any Greek military action since the War of Independence. In the Ottoman command structure, a reckoning begins. The after-action reports are collected and analyzed. The assessments are revised. The revised picture of Greek military capability that emerges from the Balkan Wars analysis is substantially different from the assessment that existed before October 1912. But the revised assessment is not the version that the official history will tell. The official history has its own requirements, and one of those requirements is that the Greek victories in the Balkan Wars be explained in terms that do not credit Greek military quality. Geography, numbers. Bulgarian pressure on the other flank. The disorganization of Ottoman forces stretched across multiple fronts against multiple enemies simultaneously. These factors were real. They were not the whole story. And the Ottoman officers who were there, who wrote the private letters and filed the after-action reports and sat in the command posts watching Greek units take positions that should not have been taken, knew the difference between the real factors and the whole story. They wrote the whole story down in the documents that their superiors tried to bury. The Second Balkan War of 1913 brings a different configuration. Greece and the Ottoman Empire briefly aligned against Bulgaria, which has overreached in its territorial claims. Greek and Ottoman forces are on the same side for a moment. It does not last. By 1914, the broader European war has begun, and the Ottoman Empire has entered on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Greek state, under the political paralysis of the national schism between King Constantine and Prime Minister Venizelos, remains officially neutral. But Greek populations inside the Ottoman Empire are not neutral. They are targets. From 1914 onward, the Ottoman military and political apparatus begins a systematic campaign against the Greek populations of Anatolia, Thrace, and Pontus. Deportations. Forced labor battalions called tabulari, labor companies, into which Greek men of military age are conscripted and worked to death in the Anatolian interior, building roads and railways under conditions that kill a significant proportion of every battalion sent. The Greek populations of the Aegean coast are driven inland, away from the coastline that Ottoman military planners consider strategically vulnerable. This is not combat. This is the deliberate destruction of a civilian population that the Ottoman military establishment has decided is a security threat because of the fighting quality it has already demonstrated. The deportations and the labor battalions are, in a specific and terrible way, a backhanded acknowledgement of what the Balkan Wars had shown. The Greek male population of military age is being removed from the coastal regions not because Greek civilians are a threat, but because the Ottoman military has seen what Greek soldiers do and has decided that the men who could become those soldiers should not be near the coastline when the war reaches it. The labor battalions kill tens of thousands. The deportations displace hundreds of thousands more. The Pontic Greeks of the Black Sea coast, communities that have been in Pontus since ancient times, that maintained Greek culture and language through centuries of Ottoman rule, are among the most severely affected. The Pontic genocide, as it is recognized today, begins in these years and continues through and beyond the First World War. On the Macedonian Front, Greek forces officially enter the war in 1917, when Venizelos, having established a rival government in Thessaloniki, brings Greece into the conflict on the Allied side. Greek troops fight alongside British, French, and Serbian forces against the Bulgarian and German forces on the Macedonian front. The Turkish forces on that front, fighting alongside their Bulgarian and German allies, encounter Greek units with the professional recognition that the Balkan Wars assessments had produced. The revised picture of Greek military capability from 1912 to 1913 has filtered through the Ottoman military establishment in the years since. The officers commanding Turkish forces on the Macedonian front in 1917 and 1918 are not working from the 1897 reference point. They are working from Sarantaporo and Giannitsa and Thessaloniki. They know what Greek infantry does on a hillside. They have prepared for it accordingly. What they have not fully prepared for is what Greek infantry does on a hillside in 1917, after 5 years of war have added combat experience to the professional reform of the pre-1912 period. The Greek units fighting on the Macedonian front in the final year of the war are among the most experienced formations the Greek army has ever fielded. They have been fighting, in one political configuration or another, under Venizelos or under the royal government, or in the chaotic middle ground between them, for 5 years. The officers who lead them at the platoon and company level are men who have fought at Sarantaporo and Giannitsa and in the Second Balkan War and in the guerrilla campaigns of Macedonia. They are professionals in the way that only continuous combat makes a soldier a professional. Turkish after-action reports from the Macedonian Front in 1917 and 1918 carry a consistency of observation that reflects the revised assessment built from the Balkan Wars. They note Greek unit cohesion under fire. They note the quality of Greek junior leadership, the platoon and company commanders whose decisions in the moment of contact determine whether a position holds or gives way. They note something that the 1912 letters had also noted, that Greek infantry attacks with a personal aggression that is distinct from the tactical aggression of professional soldiers following doctrine. It is an aggression that comes from somewhere else, from the specific knowledge of what they are fighting for and what losing means. One Turkish officer serving on the Macedonian front writes in his diary in the autumn of 1918, a diary preserved in the Turkish military archives and cited in subsequent historical analysis, that he has fought against French forces and British forces and Serbian forces on this front. He writes that the Greeks fight differently from all of them, not better trained in the formal sense, not better equipped, but animated by something he struggles to name. He writes that it is as if the Greek soldier believes that the ground he is defending belongs to him personally in a way that transcends military orders or national duty, as if losing it would be a personal loss in a way that losing ground is not personal for soldiers fighting far from their homelands. He is describing the motivation gap, the thing that 15 years of reform and 3 conflicts of accumulated experience had built into the Greek military, but that no order of battle assessment could quantify. He writes it in his diary, not in his official report. In his diary, where he can say what he actually observed rather than what the official narrative requires. The war ends in October 1918 with the Armistice of Mudros. The Ottoman Empire is defeated. The armistice terms are punishing. The Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, the United States, begin carving up what remains of Ottoman Anatolia at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And in May 1919, with Allied authorization, Greek forces land at Smyrna. The Greco-Turkish War has begun. Everything in this video is documented. Real names, real dates, real words spoken by real people in extraordinary moments. That documentation exists, but without someone telling the story, it dies in an archive. Your subscription keeps that from happening. And if this story deserved to be told, that like button is how you say so. Hit it. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 is the third and final act of a decade of conflict between Greek and Turkish soldiers. It is also the conflict that produces the most complete and most painful Turkish military documentation of Greek fighting quality. Painful because this is the war that Greece ultimately loses, and the Turkish military assessments of their opponent are therefore complicated by the need to explain both why the fighting was so difficult and why the outcome was ultimately a Turkish victory. The answer the Turkish military documentation arrives at, the answer that the official history tries to obscure and the private letters and diaries make clear, is that the Greek army was defeated not because it was a poor fighting force. It was defeated because of what was above it. the political decisions in Athens, the loss of Allied support after the 1920 election returned King Constantine, the appointment of commanders whose quality did not match the quality of the men they commanded, the strategic situation created by politicians who could not advance, could not negotiate, and could not withdraw. The Greek soldiers fighting in Anatolia between 1919 and 1922, the men whose performance the Turkish military documents with professional precision in the after-action reports of that campaign, are assessed in those documents with a consistency that runs directly from the Sarantaporo assessments of 1912. Cohesive under fire, aggressive in the attack, defensively stubborn in a way that costs the attacker more than the defender's numbers or position should allow, animated by a motivation that the Turkish military understands intellectually. These men are fighting for Anatolia, for the Greek populations of the coast, for the Megali idea and everything it represents, without being able to neutralize it tactically. The Battle of Sakarya in August and September 1921, the battle where the Greek army came within 40 miles of Ankara and could not take it, produces some of the most remarkable Turkish military documentation of Greek fighting quality in the entire decade of conflict. Mustafa Kemal, commanding the Turkish nationalist forces personally, is present throughout the 22-day battle. His observations of Greek infantry performance, recorded in his communications with his staff and in the operational assessments he sends to Ankara, reflect the professional judgment of a man who has spent his career studying war and has fought against the British at Gallipoli and the Greeks in Macedonia. Kemal does not dismiss the Greek infantry at Sakarya. He cannot. The Greek units attacking across the Sakarya River in August 1921 are doing something that very few armies in the history of that terrain have managed. Sustained offensive operations across a river under fire against prepared positions over 22 days in summer heat that breaks men and equipment equally. His private communications from the Sakarya period carry a tone that his public statements do not. Publicly, Kemal projects confidence and determination. The narrative of Turkish national resistance requires it. Privately, in the operational assessments that go to his senior commanders, he acknowledges the quality of what he is facing with a directness that the official history does not capture. He writes that the Greek infantry at Sakarya fights with a quality that he did not expect to find in an army that has been in the field for 2 years, at the end of supply lines that stretch hundreds of miles, without adequate artillery support, and with the political situation in Athens working against it at every level. He writes that the men attacking across the river are not fighting the way a depleted and politically undermined army is supposed to fight. They are fighting the way men fight when they believe in what they are doing, regardless of the conditions around them. He holds. He holds because he has built the defensive system that the terrain and his resources allow, because his cavalry is faster than Greek logistics, because the Turkish nationalist cause has its own motivation that matches the Greek motivation in the specific way that two nations fighting for the same ground produce. He holds. But the private record of how hard it was to hold, how much the Greek infantry at Sakarya cost the Turkish defensive forces, is in the documents. The documents that the official history tried to bury. After the Greek withdrawal from Sakarya, after the long stalemate of 1921 and 1922, after the great offensive of August 1922 that destroyed the Greek army in 3 weeks and drove it to the sea, after all of that, the Turkish military sits down to write the official history of the Greco-Turkish War. The official history has a specific shape. It is the history of Turkish national resurrection, of Kemal's genius and the nationalist army's determination, of a Turkish people who refused the terms imposed on them by the Paris Peace Conference and fought their way to a new nation against the combined opposition of Greek military power and allied political support. That history is real. Those things happened. Kemal was a genius. The Turkish nationalist army fought with determination and quality that justified every assessment of it. But buried inside that official history, in the after-action reports and the private correspondence and the operational assessments that professional military men write for each other when the cameras are not running, is the other story. The story of what it cost, of what the Greek soldiers who held Anatolia for 3 years actually put the Turkish military through in the process of being defeated, of the specific professional respect that accumulated in Turkish military documentation over a decade of fighting Greek soldiers across 3 conflicts. General İsmet İnönü, who commanded Turkish forces at the 2 battles of İnönü in 1921, the defensive battles that stopped the Greek advance toward Ankara before Sakarya and that bear his name, writes in his post-war memoirs about the Greek forces he faced with a professional honesty that the official nationalist narrative does not always accommodate. He writes that the Greek army he fought in 1921 was a serious military force whose defeat required everything the Turkish nationalist army had. He writes that the men who attacked at İnönü fought with a quality that his defensive preparations only barely managed to contain. He is not writing this to flatter Greece. He is writing it because he is a professional military man, and professional military men write the truth about their opponents when the war is over and the political requirements of the moment have relaxed enough to allow honesty. The truth he writes is the same truth that runs through a decade of Turkish military documentation of fighting Greeks, from the Sarantaporo after-action report of 1912 to the Sakarya operational assessment of 1921. From the private letters of officers who watched Greek infantry take positions that should not have been taken to the diary entries of men who tried to explain what made Greek soldiers fight the way they fought. The truth is simple. The Greek soldier was not what the Ottoman military expected. Not in 1912, not in 1917, not in 1921. Every time the assessment was revised upward, the next engagement produced something that required another revision. And the official history tried to bury that truth, because an official history of national triumph does not have room for the admission that the enemy was harder to beat than the narrative requires, because the men who write official histories serve the nation's need for a clean story rather than the professional obligation to record what actually happened. The private letters record what actually happened. The after-action reports, filed and then quietly archived, record what actually happened. The diary of the officer on the Macedonian Front who wrote that the Greek soldier fights as if the ground belongs to him personally. That record exists. It always existed. The story just needed someone to tell it. The decade of conflict between Greek and Turkish soldiers from 1912 to 1922 produced consequences that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that are still visible today. The Balkan Wars gave Greece the territorial gains that doubled its size. Thessaloniki, Macedonia, Epirus, the Aegean Islands. The communities that had been living under Ottoman rule for centuries became part of the Greek state. The populations that the Greek army had fought to liberate became Greek citizens. The First World War, which Greece entered late and on the winning side, positioned Venizelos at the Paris Peace Conference to negotiate the additional territorial gains that the Megali idea required. The landing at Smyrna in 1919 was the first step in those gains. The Greek army that landed there was the most experienced Greek military force in history, veterans of the Balkan Wars and the Macedonian Front, professionals who had been fighting continuously for 7 years. The Greco-Turkish War consumed all of that. The political decisions in Athens, the 1920 election that returned King Constantine and ended Allied support, the appointment of Hatzianestis to command an army he could not leave his bed to lead, the strategic paralysis that kept the army on lines it could not hold, consumed 3 years of military effort and ended in the catastrophe of 1922. But the consuming was not easy. The Turkish military documentation of what it cost to push the Greek army out of Anatolia, the after-action reports, the operational assessments, the private correspondence of officers who were honest with each other about what they had faced, tells a story that the official history of Turkish national triumph does not fully accommodate. It tells the story of an army that fought well in conditions that made fighting well almost impossible. That held Sakarya for 22 days when every logistical and political factor said it should have broken faster. That required Kemal's personal command and the full weight of a rebuilt Turkish nationalist army and a year of strategic preparation to finally break. And even then broke because of what was above it, rather than because the men at the front had stopped fighting. Mustafa Kemal, in the formal ceremony following the Greek surrender, grants the defeated Greek commander General Trikoupis the full honors of war. He tells him his men fought well. He tells him the outcome was not determined by the quality of his soldiers. The compliment is recorded. It is genuine. Kemal was not a man who said things he did not mean in professional military contexts. He is saying, in the formal language of a commander receiving the surrender of a defeated opponent, what the decade of private letters and after-action reports had been saying all along. The Greek soldiers were not what we expected. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 formally ended the conflict and established the boundaries of modern Turkey. The population exchange expelled 1.5 million Greeks from Anatolia and 500,000 Muslims from Greece. 3,000 years of Greek civilization on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor ended in months. The soldiers who fought on both sides of that decade of conflict went home, or to wherever home now was, for the Greek soldiers whose homes had been in Smyrna and Pontus and Anatolia, and who now had to find a new home in a Greek state that was struggling to absorb them. The Turkish soldiers went home to a new republic. The Greek soldiers went home to a country that was trying to process the largest humanitarian disaster in its modern history. Neither group talked much about what they had experienced. The men who fight the hardest wars are rarely the ones who talk most about them afterward. But they wrote, the ones who wrote left a record, and the record, buried in archives on both sides, says something that official history on both sides has reasons to minimize. The Greek soldier was serious. In the mountains of Macedonia in 1912, on the Macedonian Front in 1917, at the Sakarya River in 1921. Serious in a way that required serious opponents to bring him down. Serious in a way that cost his opponents more than they expected and more than they wanted to admit. That cost is in the documents that the official history tried to bury. The men who fought in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 are long gone. The last veterans of those campaigns, men who were young soldiers when they took the pass at Sarantaporo or entered Thessaloniki in November 1912, died decades ago. Their stories went with them mostly. The ones that survived did so because someone wrote them down. The men who fought on the Macedonian Front in 1917 and 1918 are also gone. The men who fought in the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, who held the Sakarya line for 22 days, or broke through at Afyon, or retreated through the burning streets of Smyrna, are gone too. What remains is the record, the official record and the private record, the history that governments wrote and the history that soldiers wrote to each other when no government was watching. The private record of what Turkish soldiers said about fighting Greeks over that decade is not a record that celebrates Greece or diminishes Turkey. It is a professional military record. The honest assessments of men who fought hard and found their opponent harder than they expected, who revised their assessments upward with each engagement, who wrote in their private letters and diaries the truth that the official history had no room for. That truth is not complicated. The Greek soldier fought with a quality that surprised the Ottoman military in 1912 and continued to surprise it through 1922. Not always successfully, not always with the result that Greek political goals required, but with a consistent professional quality that the Turkish military documentation records with the honesty that private correspondence allows and official history does not. The after-action report from Sarantaporo. The letter from the veteran of 1897 who could not reconcile the Greeks he remembered with the Greeks he was fighting. The diary from the Macedonian Front. The operational assessment from Sakarya. The formal acknowledgement from Kemal himself at the surrender ceremony. All of it says the same thing in different words. The Greek soldier was not what we expected. The ground he was defending felt like his ground in a way that changed how he fought for it. In Greece today, in the cities and villages that the Asia Minor refugees built after 1922, there are families that carry the memory of that decade in the way that families carry things that were too large to fully process and too important to forget. In the names they gave their children. In the stories that came out at family dinners, fragmentary and incomplete, about what someone's grandfather did in Macedonia, or at the Sakarya, or in the retreat from Anatolia. In Turkey today, in the military academies and the historical institutes that study the War of Independence, the decade of conflict with Greece is taught as the story of national liberation, which it was. Kemal's achievement was real. The Turkish Nationalist Army's performance was real. The outcome was real and permanent and shaped the modern Middle East. But in the archives, in the after-action reports and the private letters and the diaries of the men who were there is another story running alongside the official one. The story of what it cost, of what the men on the other side of those engagements were like, of the professional respect that accumulated over a decade of fighting an opponent who kept being harder than the assessment said he should be. That story is in the documents that the official history tried to bury. They exist. They always did. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. Don't skip it. We carry these stories carefully, every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? If your family has roots in any of the places this video describes, in Macedonia, in Pontus, in Anatolia, in the communities that fought and lost and rebuilt, tell us in the comments. We read everything. Thank you for carrying the weight of these soldiers' story forward, the ones who took Sarantaporo, the ones who held the Sakarya, the ones who fought in conditions that should have broken them and didn't break. They bore something heavier than the ground they were defending. The least we can do is remember it.